Today's going to be actually a conversation as opposed to just a straight presentation. And it's with Dr. Darrell Ray, and he's going to be talking about how early childhood indoctrination often leads a really deep mark on people, and too often it looks a lot like other kinds of trauma. And whether you were traumatized by religion or not, you were probably affected. And to tell you why we're going to be listening to Dr. Ray, it's because Dr. Ray, one, is an awesome guy and a good friend, and he's taken a cruise with us, and we really enjoy spending time with him. But he's also the founder and the president of the board of directors for Recovering from Religion. He has been a psychologist for over 30 years. He's the author of not one, not two, but 4 books, 2 on organizational teamwork, as well as The God Virus, How Religion Infects Our Lives and Culture, and Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. He was raised in a fundamentalist Christian home, and he knows religion from the inside out. He has a BA in sociology, an MA in religion, an ED in counseling psychology from Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. And for 30 years, Dr. Ray was in practice as a clinical psychologist, then an organizational psychologist, and wrote 2 books in that field. And he left religion himself in his early 30s and continued to ask the question, how does religion work on the mind and behavior of those it infects? And so no other people seem to be really digging into this, and so Dr. Ray did. And I'm going to stop continuing to introduce him, but I will say again, he is a wonderful, wonderful human being, and we are so happy to have him here. Also with him today, we have Becca Ray and Joseph Richardson, who are going to be, functioning as people to ask questions and interact with, because we want this presentation to be more than just a presentation. We want it to be a conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ray, and I'll be in the background. Thanks.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Sound okay on my end? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Good. Well, thanks. I didn't realize I would be talking to Becca Ray, my sister, my long lost sister, by the way. I was born in a family of 4 boys. We didn't have a sister, and we wanted one in the worst way. But so
well, anyway. I get my name by marriage, so.
Oh well, okay. We'll adopt you. No.
You know my wife. Did you put those dots together yet?
Okay, well, so we're going to talk about religious trauma, and I've asked Jocelyn to bring some people in, Joseph and Becca, to help me out, because I'd rather this be more conversational and talk stuff that's relevant for you that are listening. So feel free to throw questions into the chat as we go along, and they'll kind of sort them out, and we'll definitely have a Q&A at the end. So I want to begin by giving a little bit of caution. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today might be difficult. I don't think they'll be really that bad, but I just want to let you know, we may stir up some feelings, and that's not my intention. My intention is to educate. I'm also not intending on giving you diagnostic criteria. This is more for information. It's not for treatment. It's not for diagnosis. So with that said, I don't want you leaving here and saying, oh, I know I've got RTS or religious trauma syndrome, because we're always the worst people at diagnosing ourselves. You might have some hints, and if you do, then go find a therapist and talk to them about it. Get a proper diagnosis, or at least a proper therapist that can help you. So let's begin by saying, what is trauma? And trauma is literally a change in the brain. And we know this because we can see trauma causing a change in the stress hormones, a change in the way the amygdala responds to external stimulus, and a change in the way people respond by way of fight or flight, and in the way they respond to their environment. So some of the signs of trauma, and this is not, again, I don't want you to think I'm here to help you diagnose yourself, but some of the signs of trauma are wired, that you're hypervigilant, hyperarousal. Those are both symptoms or signs of trauma when you just seem to always be on high alert. You're wired to expect danger. You're wired to interpret danger in otherwise normal circumstances. Now, we all know that people come back from, say Iraq or Vietnam or World War II, wars are, we know a lot about trauma because of war. And we realize that people came back from war, they had been in a heightened state of alert for months, if not years. And then when they come home, their brain continues to function then that way for long periods of time, and they don't get over it. Well, that's a clear sign of trauma. So those are some of the underlying pieces that we need to understand. Hair trigger emotions, hair trigger internal responses to normal things outside. And it can also, when we look at it, we're going to look at it more depth around religion. And this may relate to you. I don't know, Sarah, Joseph. I'm going down the highway and I see a damn religious sign up, Jesus saves or you're going to hell. I have an internal response to that stuff. I'm guessing you do too. What do you have a response to that? Either one of you?
Yeah, well, I was a Christian until I was 49, and I'm only 57 now, so I'm only 8 years out of it. And so I absolutely feel stuff like that. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm guessing. What are you going to say, Sarah?
I'm sorry.
Becca?
Absolutely. I think it's hard to not have a response to it when you've spent so much time like believing that it was true.
Yeah, right. Well, other things that are signs of it are intrusive thoughts. And these intrusive thoughts, when we add religion to it, and I'm going to start adding religion a little bit here, is things like thoughts that, oh, demons are controlling my thought process, or I wouldn't think that if it wasn't a demon telling me that, or the devil. Fear of hell, huge in our chat line at Recovering from Religion. I would say almost maybe even more than 50% of all the people who chat in with us say, I can't sleep at nights because I have a fear of hell. I can't talk to my mom because she's always threatening with hell and I can't sleep that night. So sleep disruption as a result of fear, in this case, fear of hell, but it could be of other things too that related to religion, can be signs of religious trauma, especially if they're not just temporary. They seem to go on and on and on over a long period of time. Also, cognitive traps or cognitive loops. And that could be a part of, I just can't stop thinking I'm wrong. I can't stop thinking that I need to go back and do something different to be saved again, even though I've left religion. I can't stop thinking about all the things that are sinful that I'm doing now, even though I don't even believe in sin anymore. I mean, those cognitive loops can go round and round your head and you can't stop them, or it's very difficult to stop them. Another possible sign, and I want to underline possible sign of trauma. And last, of course, is depression. People can have a response to trauma by being depressed, becoming depressed, and the cognitive loops keep them there. The other interruptions in cognitive functioning can keep them there. They don't know how to get out of it. They're trapped, so to speak. Hold on. Excuse me. So I want to back up and begin talking about children and childhood indoctrination. And we have some pretty good data, scientific data around what we call adverse childhood experiences. In fact, the Center for Disease Control even has some pretty good stuff on its website about what causes trauma from childhood experiences. I can give you the links to that afterwards, perhaps. But they look at abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Those three things all can lead to childhood adverse childhood experiences. Now you notice they're using the term adverse. They're not using trauma, because there can be a lot of things that we experience that are adverse. I don't like it, but it doesn't necessarily mean I am traumatized or that it was even a trauma. in the way we're talking about it here. So children can be physically abused, they can be emotionally abused, they can be sexually abused. All of those things would go under the heading of adverse childhood experiences. Physical neglect and emotional neglect, same thing. The interesting thing about this paradigm that the Centers for Disease Control has, and I've looked at it. I've looked at you can actually take a test. You can go online and take this test, and when you're finished with the test, a very short test, you'll probably have a good idea of whether you personally experience serious adverse childhood experiences. Of course, you may not need a test to tell you that, but that might lead you to some deeper insight into maybe your own behavior. Maybe you've still got some fears. Maybe you've still got some reactions to your environment that other people don't seem to have, and you'd like to get to the bottom of that. So adverse childhood experiences are the basis for all this. And the CDC, interestingly enough, does not even mention religion. Religion isn't on the radar for what an adverse childhood experience might be. Now, I'm not going to criticize the CDC too harshly because what they've done here is really worthwhile. And you might say, well, religious abuse comes underneath that. Well, I would suggest that religious abuse is not even asked. It's not even questioned. So that a parent who is religiously abusing somebody might not even show up on the radar of a home visitation from a child care worker. And I kind of know this from experience. I was for a while, I was a child care worker with the welfare department in our home county. They used to call it welfare department. Shows how old I am. And I know that I saw religious abuse in homes, and I talked to my supervisor about it, and they say, well, that's not religious abuse because it's religious. You can beat the shit out of your child, I guess, as long as you're doing it in the name of Jesus. And that was literally the way I was trained back in the 70s and 80s, early in my career as a mental health professional. So even our current state-of-the-art stuff has not deigned to look at religious trauma, religious abuse that causes trauma. So let's look at any thoughts or questions, Joseph, Becca, so far?
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering if you could expand just a little bit. I think you kind of answered the question, but I was thinking, why is it that they don't put religion under this? Are they just trying to stay away from that completely, or what? I don't know.
Well, I think it's like a lot of areas of our society. Religion gets a pass. And that's what I have observed. And I've observed it a lot since then. We get a lot of, Jehovah's Witness, for example, we get a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. Oh, were you, Becca? Okay.
Yeah.
And what I know and what I've seen, I wasn't a JW, but I have so many friends that were JWs. And the kind of treatment that is just typical of children raised in a JW family looks like if you took religion out, it would be abuse. There's no question about it. Becca, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, let me tag on there. I grew up in a fairly, it was toxic in a way that we were dysfunctional.
Yeah.
I liked to question things and push, and my mom just was like, don't do that. My mom and dad had a weird dynamic. They never were abusive, but the doctrine was what was abusive.
Yeah.
None of the rest of my family were witnesses. We were being taught that all of the rest of our family and anybody that wasn't a witness was going to die at Armageddon. And then we were given these like lessons about what Armageddon is going to look like. And I remember having nightmares, like as an 8-year-old child, about my family dying in Armageddon. And that's something that I carried for a long time. So while my parents weren't abusive towards me, and I don't think that their decisions to raise me in that religion were malicious in any way, it was still very traumatic for me as a child to come out of that. And like it it took years of therapy. Just say that.
Okay. Yeah, it does.
Mm.
And I think you've hit an important component. Your parents weren't intentionally abusing you, but the doctrine of the church creates an abusive, toxic environment. I mean, your parents could accidentally send you to a school that's full of, cancerous causing toxic fumes or asbestos or something, and they would not think they were doing the wrong thing. And that's kind of what we see here is they don't see it as wrong. It's a part of their belief structure, their worldview. So if other people have those experiences, I noticed in the chat, I've seen some people. I'm just glancing through it. It looks like some other people have had these fear of anxiety and terrors over sleep terrors over hell and stuff like that. So feel free to put those in the chat. It's always good to kind of get some interaction and see what other people have experienced in that. So we know that there is neurological impact on trauma because we can see it in many ways on the limbic system, the functioning of the limbic system in humans. We can see the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis activity with lots of different a lot of variability around cortisol levels. I mean, we can literally measure these things. These are no longer theory. With current science and current medical technology and current MRIs and stuff like that, we now have the ability to see this stuff and understand it. We can see that dysregulation of neurotransmitters. So it's not, it's a fact in these days. And the interesting thing of these facts that we know about trauma now in children were first actually noticed and recognized clear back in the 1920s and 30s by someone all of us have heard about, and that's Pavlov in Russia. And what we don't know, most people in the United States, North America, even the West, don't know is that Pavlov did a tremendous amount of research on basically traumatizing dogs. Now, today, it would be totally unethical to do what he did, but that's 1920s and 30s, and it was under Stalin. So Stalin learned, or Stalin's KGB learned, literally how to brainwash people by traumatizing them. And he used the methods and techniques that Pavlov learned in dogs. So a lot of the early knowledge about trauma comes right out of the research Pavlov did with dogs. And now we can see in the same thing in dogs and in other animals that we all react, our brains react to trauma in very similar ways. But children are very susceptible. And we know that you can traumatize a young organism, a young child, a young dog, much more effectively and efficiently when they're small and young. There is good news, though, and that is that if a child is being subjected to some kind of toxic environment, if they have supportive adults around them, if they can be removed from the environment, or if the child has resources to support them, they might not experience trauma. And in this case, for example, I was raised not nearly as bad as JW, so I'm not going to say that, but I was raised in a pretty fundamentalist environment. And I had some interesting relatives around me that were very supportive of me. And even though they were religious themselves, they didn't push any of the toxicity on me. So I could always go talk to them. And they were also pretty liberal. So I think I probably escaped any kind of religious trauma because I had some supportive adults around me, and I had some other things going for me. But not everybody does. And Becca, you may have had supportive parents. Even in that toxic environment, they may have helped you survive a little bit better than maybe somebody else who was JW. Were you gonna say something there?
It's amazing where you can find allies, and I'll just say that I was very lucky. My grandmother was not a witness, and she told me every chance that she got that I was in a cult.
Interesting.
And so I just always had that in the back of my mind, and that was ultimately what made me start really questioning. But I would say, as somebody now that doesn't have a belief, I'm very much open when I know, like I have friends that are religious, and I try not to push them away, because
Right.
I feel like if they feel like they can't talk about that with you when they do have doubts, or when they are in a place where they can reason on it, then you've pushed them away, and you might not be able to help them.
Yep.
So because, and I think I feel that way because my grandmother was that person for me. So
Excellent.
I think it's very important to be aware of the people in your life, and always be open to those conversations, not in an aggressive way, but just as a, hey, I'm open for a conversation.
Yeah, you could be the cool aunt or the cool uncle that the kid can go to, and you can drop little hints and you can support them. And I think that's exactly right, Becca. Oh, and by the way, your attitude is almost exactly the way we train all our volunteers at Recovering from Religion. Oh, and feel free to volunteer for us if you want. I've always tried to recruit, so there you go.
I will keep that in consideration.
Well, it is. It's something. What you just said is something I find a lot of atheists, especially lifelong atheists, people that were never infected with religion to begin with, and I use that word intentionally, infected, is they oftentimes do not understand what's going on in the neurology of somebody who was brainwashed, who was infected with religion. And so they have little patience, and they'll want to argue, well, it's logical. Religion doesn't make any sense. Well, I won't disagree. Religion doesn't make any sense, but that has nothing to do with childhood indoctrination, with trauma, the trauma that you experienced. And part of the reason I'm doing this talk today, I've done this talk several times, is I want to educate the larger atheist community on what's going on, because I think we need to learn compassion and educate ourselves about what's actually happening inside the brains of people who had religious, who were traumatized by religion. So I'm going to share my screen here, if I can. Okay. Looks like I did it. All right, cool. So we at this, as you may know, I started the Secular Therapy Project back in 2012, and it's grown dramatically. We've got over 20,000 clients at seculartherapy.org, and we've got almost 450 licensed, registered, evidence-based psychotherapists that will never pray with you or send you back to church or say atheism is the reason you're depressed or any of that bullshit. We did a survey among our therapists recently, about 6 or 8 months ago, before the virus came. And we asked our therapists, in your professional experience, what % of clients mention adverse childhood experiences related to religion in some significant way? For example, spanking for not learning your Bible verses, punishment for masturbating, parents abusing gay siblings, threats of hell or disobedience. And what we found was about 36%, 38%, I can't read my own thing here, of our therapists said they were getting that complaint. So if you have a complaint like this, chances are you have experienced some kind of religious trauma. And that's an important thing to know. And it's also an important thing for your therapist to know. You might make sure, if you're going to see a counselor, help them understand the concept of religious trauma, because most therapists these days, that's not even on their radar. They've never even heard the concept before. Now, hopefully, if you've got a therapist from Secular Therapy Project, they do, but it never hurts to bring that out and ask your therapist to help you understand that component. And I will say that I regret that I did not know this 30 years ago, 35 years ago, when I first started my own psychological practice, because I think I met a lot of people, a number of people in my practice that were suffering from trauma directly related to their religious upbringing. And I was not educated, or even, it never even crossed my radar to bring that up. So I would have been a better psychologist, been a better therapist had I known, had I had an avenue for helping people in that area. And I think we're there now, and that's why I'm doing the talk today. I want to educate everybody and get people to start talking about this, because as we've said earlier, religion gets a pass. Nobody talks about it. It's swept under the rug. So let's look at some other issues that come up with religious trauma. And that is, what if your entire environment is toxic? Yes, but your parents are the very source of the fear. The people that are most important to your safety and development are the ones that are threatening you with hell, the ones that are spanking you for not learning your Bible verses. Think about that. If you weren't raised religious, or even if you were, but you weren't raised in one of these toxic religions, the shaming, the threatening, there's literally a 3, a 5, a 7, a 10-year-old kid has no safe space to go. They are trapped in an environment that is constantly a threat to them emotionally and maybe even physically. How is that different than a soldier in Iraq with mortars falling around them, or the threat of some sniper is going to shoot them and they've got to stay on hyper alert? A 3-year-old, a 5-year-old in that environment is being treated by their own parents, their own environment, in much the same way that a soldier in a war is being treated. And I am not trying to denigrate the fear, the terror that a soldier would feel. I'm trying to show the comparison. It's an environment that's incredibly threatening. And to a young child, it feels life-threatening. And so their brain responds to constantly need to monitor themselves. They constantly have to watch their own behavior. They constantly have to fear religious consequences. And I'm going to show you some quotes that illustrate this right now. The most important thing that happens during this phase is, you remember the Jesuit said, give me the child till 7 and give me the boy till 7 and I'll give you the man. Well, that just means if I can brainwash a kid before 7 years old, they're probably going to stick around forever. They will certainly feel the shame and guilt and fear. Now, what we see, though, is that causes people to literally skip developmental steps or miss entire steps in their developmental life as a child. So when they get to be older, they show signs of developmental dysfunction. They act or do things that are not appropriate for their age level, partly because they were abused or missed a developmental stage. We've had people tell us, I feel like I missed my childhood because I was so afraid. I missed my adolescence because I was always in church and afraid my body. It was changing and growing sexually, so I missed it. Does that sound familiar, Becca? Is it
Yeah.
Joseph?
Yeah.
Joseph, what do you think?
I was nodding my head and snickering. Yes.
Okay.
I have a joke among my friends that I grew up with that were also raised as witnesses, and they're not anymore, that when we left, we had to go through our second adolescence.
That is really, really true. Did you experience that too, Joseph?
I wouldn't have identified it that way, so I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you really literally do go back and try to pick up developmental stages. We see that a lot in people. So it's a normal thing. In fact, we actually train our agents to watch and listen for that, and to tell the clients that are chatting in or phoning calling us that is perfectly normal. So how can we help you get through that stage safely? Because going back and being an adolescent at 40 years of age might have some negative consequences. Even though
there's a question that applies to this.
Yeah.
Franklin just asked, how do you find someone to safely guide you through a second adolescence?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think one way is to join a group, find a community that you can kind of bounce things off with. I mean, the XJW groups that I'm familiar with are pretty good places to bounce ideas and bounce experiences off of. And it helps you normalize. I think part of why people act out, and when I say act out, they're really trying to find they're trying to recreate the developmental phase they missed. When they act out, they're oftentimes unaware. They weren't even taught the appropriate ways to act. And most obviously it happens with sexuality. When people are exploring their sexuality at age 30 or 40, and they don't know how to do that appropriately. They don't know how to date appropriately. They don't know how to interact with a potential partner appropriately. So having somebody to interact might be helpful. Of course, the other thing is, as I've already said before, a good therapist can help you reestablish equilibrium much quicker. My observation is, when you leave a worldview that's so consuming as something like a high control religion, like JW's, or Mormons are really bad about it. You are thrown into a massive level of disequilibrium. You're just, we have so many people that just say, I'm so off balance. Nothing is right. I can't figure out what the right things are in this world or not. Because once you step out of that bubble, you got a whole new set of rules to follow or learn or relationship issues to deal with. So I found if you've got a good therapist or even just a really good friend that is, out of religion and has gone through some of this, they can say, yeah, okay, I went through that too, and here's how I got through it. Or,
and just as a reminder, you can find secular therapists through the Secular Therapist Project at Recovery from Religion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fairly simple. You just go on there, register as a client, and search the database and reach out to somebody who, who you think could be helpful to you. So, one of my pet peeves is that a lot of therapists are terribly trained in this area. And they were trained because right now in the Secular Therapy Project, we actually have a team that's working on challenging institutions around this issue that religion is harmless, that religion is benign. Many therapy schools training psychologists, social workers, counselors absolutely refuse to deal with the notion that religious can be abusive and cause trauma. So we are pushing that now. Our own therapists in Secular Therapy Project, they're damn well trained and they understand what's going on much better than the average therapist would. But if you're looking for a good counselor, I would ask them right up front, do you know anything about religious trauma syndrome? And if they haven't even heard of it, I'd be a little cautious about. I'd be cautious the first 2 or 3 sessions to make sure you're getting the treatment you need. So, because so many therapists are just unaware of how this happens. Let me use a metaphor. As you know, I like to use the word infected. I wrote a whole book, The God Virus, on that idea. If 60% of the population was infected with tapeworms, we would think, yeah, it's normal to be infected with tapeworms, but it's still debilitating. It's not a good thing to be infected with tapeworms. Well, religion is simply an infection, a tapeworm infection of the mind. It debilitates you because it takes away energy. It certainly takes away money. It certainly distracts you with time. I mean, how much, Becca or Joseph, how much of your time and your money and your resources, and your energy did you give to that religion while you were in it? Are you afraid to say?
A lot.
Yeah. And if you didn't have to do that, what would you do with that time, money, and energy?
Oh, I don't like to think about that.
Right.
I gave away 3 nights a week plus 90 hours a month.
Ooh.
Right.
So,
and
that's
so
right. You kept track of it.
How many? Well, the JWs have this that you have
Yeah.
to track your field service hours, and I was a pioneer, and the requirement was that I had to put in 90 hours a month. So
yeah,
that's like on average for what, over the course of 10, 15 years, whatever it was. I don't know.
yeah, crazy.
Ugh.
You won't be surprised, both of you won't be surprised, that we get tons of people chatting in on the Recovery from Religion chat line saying, I feel like I wasted my life. I regret all that I gave to my church. We have ministers and Sunday school teachers saying, man, I hate that I indoctrinated all these children or all these people in my church. And there's a lot of, and they feel shame, they feel guilt about that. And we really work hard with these people to say, look, you were doing the best you could with what you knew at the time. And now that you know better, you can do better. That's our motto. Now that you know better, you can do better. And forgiving yourself and moving along is, you probably, I mean, you're probably much healthier. You probably are doing things to support yourself and your family better. There's a lot of things that are probably good now because of the new skills that you've learned. So we get quotes from our clients all the time. And this one, I just thought this was classic. It's so easy to lose touch with reality when you're not dealing with reality in the first place. And this person was talking about how crazy his behavior was. And it was a guy, a crazy his behavior was while he was still a Christian, and how just out of touch with reality his own behavior was. And when he got out, he looked back and this was the quote he gave us in one of our chats. Dr. Marlene Winnell was the person who coined the term religious trauma syndrome. And I like what she says here. In general, people have not survived an authoritarian fundamentalist indoctrination, don't realize what a complete mind rape it is. And it is. If you have never experienced it, you don't know. It's like when somebody says, unless you were in Iraq in combat, you can never understand what I went through. And I totally believe them. If somebody told me that from World War I or World War II or the Civil War, I would believe them. I have never been in my life in a situation like that. And what we want to do is recognize that people have been through emotional combat in their own homes as a 3-year-old. And is it any surprise that they are responding to their environment once leaving a religion in ways that may be dysfunctional, may be difficult for them to adjust to the real world, the reality world out there? Here's an interesting quote. Basically, my family were and still are very end times oriented. My whole childhood was filled with daily fear that I had missed the rapture, like literally every single day. It was all I could think about. I asked for help from my family and other church members, and they basically told me to pray and trust God, which didn't help me at all. I'm at the point where I no longer logically believe any of this, but the fear that I have is instinctual. It completely bypasses my rational mind and puts me in a state of panic. I'm 30 years old, and I wish I could just live and be free from fear. Now, I don't know if any of you watching this can relate to that. I'm guessing some of you can. This is the kind of trauma we see almost every day at Recovering from Religion. And there's probably no way for this person to move beyond this without some therapy support. This person was 30 years old. They'd been out of religion for several years and they were still dealing with this. Of course, we recommended you go get a good therapist. But this is not easy to get over. And we have to acknowledge that how expensive is it for somebody to go through life with that kind of fear? And when I talk about expense, I mean, how much is this costing you in emotional health, in physical health, and in monetary well-being? I mean, you may be losing a job, you may not getting a promotion, you may not be managing your money well, all because you are dealing with this. So I get a lot of people saying, I can't afford therapy. And I say, well, how can you afford depression? Can you afford depression? Can you afford to ignore physical symptoms that you're showing? And that's my response to people when they are displaying traumatic behavior, traumatic responses, and aren't successfully dealing with them. I'm going to move on because I'm getting a little short on time, but there's another example. I had a panic attack Saturday when I stepped foot in a church for the first time in 9 years. I thought I could handle it. I know it seems weird, but the level of indoctrination is deep. Another client said those pervasive beliefs are like a dormant virus. I never know when they will activate. And oh, by the way, that person had never read my book, didn't even know about my book. So they figured that out all by themselves. It has left me hating men in the church and then struggling with men outside of it. All I seem to have experienced is weirdness or abuse. Everyone seems so scared all the time. So here's an example of somebody whose sexuality, whose ability to interact with people of the opposite of another sex or gender is been disrupted. And that's probably a sign of trauma.
Can I ask you a question here?
Yeah, Joseph.
this made me think of, this past week, there's been that picture that floated around of Jerry Falwell Jr. with his wife's assistant, and both of them had their pants just unbuttoned a little bit. And he played it off. You know the story.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I thought of that as while you were reading this and thinking about, or the previous one. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, about how weird. I mean, that was, in my opinion, that was a pretty innocent picture, actually.
For an atheist, it would be, yeah.
Yeah. But for him, he's now taken a leave of absence from his post and gone on. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but.
Well, I will say this, that people like Jerry Falwell, and probably the vast majority, when I say vast majority, I mean 95%, probably 99% of the students at Liberty University have experienced what we're talking about right here. You do not go to Liberty University, generally speaking, unless you are pretty brainwashed to begin with. And if you were that indoctrinated, did you go to that university thinking, if I see somebody I'm physically attracted to, and then I go and masturbate tonight, thinking about that person, I've just sinned against God. So every fucking time you interact with your own body, you then have a shame response. And I'm pretty darn sure Jerry Falwell was raised that way. So in some ways, Joseph, I actually have compassion for people like Jerry Falwell in that sense. He was abused as a child. I mean, we all saw his father, a lot of us. The guy was an asshole, but he was probably raised by his parents that way too. It's generational. It goes from generation to generation. Now, I'm not excusing their abuse of other people and human beings. I'm just saying it's, and I said it, I wrote extensively about it at the end of my book, The God Virus. I say, we really do need to understand and have compassion for why these people are behaving the way they are. I'm not excusing it, but I think understanding it is very important. You can't help somebody if you're too damn convinced, too condemning of them. It kind of goes back to what you said earlier, Becca. You can't have a conversation with somebody if you're, putting them down for being too stupid or, whatever people do. So, yeah, great question. Thanks for bringing that up, Joseph. I would like to counsel all atheists, all secularists, to be compassionate about even compassionate about religious people. And I do counsel that in the last chapter of my book. Look, these folks have been traumatized. They have been abused. And is it any wonder that they abuse other people? The biggest predictor of a child abuse is having been abused yourself. That's the biggest predictor. So, yeah, anyway. Here's another quote. I started to wonder if all the damage has damaged me believing in the God of the Bible. It has traumatized my family because they lost me. I did lose me. I became so scared and religious, so scared of hell. I was depressed and obsessed with having my family that I lost a normal connection with them. I don't sleep properly most nights, and now I'm scared of what I've done to my mom. I can't tell you how many we get these daily. These aren't something we get occasionally. It's every single day. So So what I'm going to tell you is get some counseling if these things are a part of what you've experienced. You can't, a therapist needs to be trained in this stuff. A therapist needs to use evidence-based methods. We see far too many therapists who were poorly trained, or they have their own religious agenda. I can show you, and I've known therapists that were excellent. They had excellent training. However, their own superstitions and God belief got in the way the minute religion came in to the equation in the client relationship. And unfortunately, that leads to things like sexuality. If you believe God, if you believe the God stuff, you probably also believe a lot of the God stuff around sexuality. And so that's pretty damaging. bad therapists can cause more mental health problems. In some ways, it's better to get no treatment in that situation. And if your therapist tells you anything to do with your stance on religion or God has to do with your mental health, you probably want to take a second look at that person. You can't pray away your depression. You can't pray away your sinful thoughts, that sort of stuff. A lot of the roots of all this come from religious homeschooling, academic restriction. I mean, think of the abuse. It is abuse if you think about it, with a kid that's being raised in a fundamentalist home that never gets exposed to good academics or good exposed to evolution or good biology. When they get out of Liberty University, all they know is all the apologetic arguments about it. They're never going to make it in the world if they want to be a biologist. Anyway, I'm going to move on here. The dating restrictions that you see at places like Bob Jones University, that literally prohibited blacks and whites from dating until not that long ago. Those are all creating developmental roadblocks for people. I mean, how do you develop a proper understanding of relationships if you can't even have one, if you can't even hold hands, if you can't even date, and the only purpose for dating is to marry somebody? And I'm a great example of this. Too many religious people get married because they want to have sex, but they can't have sex outside of marriage. So, so I did that. 20 years old, I got married to my then 19-year-old wife. And so we could have sex. Well, it was a terrible relationship. It was a terrible marriage. We should have never been married to each other. Even my own daughter says, Dad, I don't know how you and Bob ever got along. We stayed married for 18 years, that we're about as opposite and different as we could be. And it was all because we wanted to get married to have sex. And you don't, and I'm sure other people have experienced that as well. But we get a ton of people reporting that. If that has happened to you, or if you did that when you were young, put a comment in the chat. I'm curious about that. Did you do that, Joseph?
No.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, I still married once. My wife is a Christian, and I got married as a Christian, but we got married a little bit later, 28.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't do the married thing, but all those other boxes. I mean, we weren't allowed to date until you were married, but I was like, whatever.
Yeah.
But I'm checking all of these boxes. I was homeschooled from 6th grade and up. You don't need to go to college. Armageddon's going to come before you ever graduate high school. Don't worry about it. Here I am,
wow.
37 years old. Yeah, not allowed to hang out with people outside of the religion. Check.
Yeah. So you missed out on entire opportunities to learn how to develop relationships.
Yeah, it was a struggle. Like, fortunately, like I did have my extended family. My mom made exceptions. I was allowed to go hang out with my cousins, who were not witnesses. So I was exposed to normal people.
Yeah, right.
But like, then, I mean, I have so many friends who did not have that luxury and who still today have. It's just obvious sometimes when you see the way that they interact, and it's like, oh man, you just
I know. Yeah, very much.
We got a couple of people responding in the comments that yes, they married young just so they could have sex. Yeah,
I know so many. I'd say out of the 10 people I hung out with, 7 of them did.
Oh wow,
Before the age of 20.
Yep. And it usually is. They get you. They really program you. If you're not married by 20, is something wrong with you?
Oh yeah. I moved away because I was getting that. Oh, you're like 26 and you're not married. What's wrong with you? So I just left town.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this whole most religions are designed to make you hate your body, so you'll come back to religion to get forgiveness. It creates a huge conflict between my natural biological drives that are going to happen no matter what, and the religious notion of biology, which is pretty useless, actually. And then you get the other kinds of programming, and we get a lot of these complaints. People that saw the Left Behind series or The Thief in the Night, and it creates ongoing terror. Some of our clients have only seen that movie one time, and they have had nightmares for 20 years. I mean, a single event can, in fact, traumatize somebody and create religious trauma syndrome under the right conditions, especially if it's done in a place where you're socially isolated, in a group at church camp or something like that. So a lot of people had their mountaintop experiences with Jesus or God at church camp. And just as many people were fucked up at church camp too, with things like the Left Behind series or whatever. So I'm going to move. Oh yeah, and the so-called leadership training. Wow, that is really an insidious approach, because I never met anybody who went through leadership training at a church camp that looked anything like true leadership. And I was a psychologist teaching leadership for 30 years. I know a bit about leadership. I haven't seen it there in the churches. I'm going to move on. Here's one quote I thought was kind of funny. Again, it's from somebody who never knew. It's infuriating to see how religion victimizes people who already have enough challenges. Kind of like a virus that doesn't give a shit if it damages or kills you, as long as it gets passed along to the next billion. I read that somewhere, LOL. And that person had just finished reading my book, so I think it was able to apply it to themselves. So there's so many things I could say about this, but we're running low on time, and I don't want Jocelyn to keep me off of here too quickly. But I do like to say that there's hope. And I would just read this quote. Religion destroyed my life. Making real important choices filtered through faith had catastrophic results in my experience. I owe YouTube atheists, Hitchens, this show, and other critical thinkers for my successful climb out of the pit I find myself in due to the religion of my appeasing of religious people. I now only have faith that there is no God, and enjoying my emancipation from this most stupid, cruel, and wicked proposal. So we do see people who pulled out, and I still think this person is probably facing issues, but they're aware of it, and they're trying to climb out of it. Okay, so one thing that religion does is it teaches us shame and guilt. And if you've heard any of my talks, I'm always trying to help people understand how even as an out atheist, you may still carry with you some of the shame and guilt that religion put into you. So it can still, the trauma can still work with you, can still impact your ability to create relationships, still make you have trouble sleeping at night, those sorts of things. So I think one of the biggest things I see in my own practice over the years was this sexual dysfunction. So many people are scared to death of their own body, scared to death to express their sexuality without fear or shame, and still have this thing that, if I look at pornography, if I think about somebody in lust, I'm still committing a sin. If I masturbate, I mean, all those things are still can be in your head. So you can have cognitive distortions even without trauma. And I want to emphasize, Jocelyn read something earlier, the thing I put out that she read, and that you may not have been personally traumatized yourself, but you probably were affected. And the reason I say that is I met so many atheists, even lifelong atheists, that still had religious ideas about their sexuality, for example. Still thought that, if you masturbate too much, it'll destroy your relationships. Simple things that are deeply and clearly religion-based. The whole notion of sex addiction, for example. I've got entire talks on the myth of sex addiction. But so many so many atheists still have notions in their head about that they think, well, there could be sex addiction. No, there's not. We could do a whole thing on that. So I'm about finished here. Jocelyn, if you have any of these things, even moderate sexual problems, panic attacks, any kind of response to religious signs, anger about lost opportunities, all those things we've already talked about, you have been affected, whether you've been traumatized or not. I had some other things I want to go through, but I'm going to just skip through here. And
There's been one question that's been
Yeah.
coming up several times, which is this is mainly seemingly focused on conservative Christians. What about people who don't necessarily fall into that category? So you may have what I would define as perhaps not as conservative, but then other religions as well. I mean, are you seeing the same sorts of trauma? What sort of variance is there in relation to, again, the religion itself, and then how religious it is in the household or in the community?
That's a good question, because you're right. I haven't focused on those two issues. I hear really two issues. One, what about the less fundamentalist, less controlling Christian religions? And then what about other religions? First of all, let me just say that we don't see near the trauma. I mean, if you're raised at United Church of Christ or a Unitarian, we don't see trauma there. We may see some, there might be some hesitancy around some kinds of understandings about sexuality, but generally speaking, there's pretty good sex education. Unitarian Church has got incredibly good sex education called Our Whole Lives program. So I don't think all religion is toxic. If I've left that opinion, that's not my opinion. I don't think the Quakers are particularly toxic. I certainly don't think the UCC, and I don't think the Unitarians are toxic. But every time you take a closer step towards basic doctrine, basic Christian doctrine, you're getting more and more toxic. I don't care who you are. If you're a Catholic, you got issues. I've never been able to meet a serious Catholic that didn't have sexual issues, for example. So let's move to the other side. Islam we get a ton of chats from Islamic people and Islamic or former Muslims and from Islamic countries. We even have a protocol at Government Religion that we follow to be sure those people are protected, because you can get your head cut off for talking with us sometimes in some countries. But the deal is, I have seen phenomenal amounts of trauma in Islam. And I dare say Islam traumatizes children about as much as any Christian sect I know. And I mean the average run-of-the-mill Muslim person in Iraq or in Pakistan has been traumatized. And let me just say, many of these cultures, not all of Islam does this, but a good deal of Islam in many of the countries practices circumcision, not just of girls, but of boys. And they don't do it when the child's an infant. They do it when the child's 12 years old. Think about your parents who love you and feel good about it. You feel good and you feel protected. And one day they say, oh, we're going to go take you do this wonderful thing for God. And you get, with no anesthesia, you get female genital mutilation or male circumcision. And you have to deal with that kind of pain for weeks afterwards, probably. How could that not be traumatizing?
I don't know how it couldn't be.
Yeah.
That sounds horrific ever since I learned it existed. Do you
Yeah.
want me to stop sharing your screen? Should we?
Oh, I'm going to get out right
Okay.
now. Thank you.
Because
Sorry about
I
that.
can do that if you like.
Okay, yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just figured, we'll go back, and that way people can see our faces.
I'm happy about that. Yeah.
Yes, and that's a good thing. But yeah, there were some other questions too that I wanted to get to, because I know some students.
Yeah.
I teach, so sorry. I don't mean to call everyone on the call or on the Zoom today a student. Yes, so I'm trying to scroll back through them.
I've got one if you want to.
Yeah,
Sure, go for it, Joseph.
Joseph, go for it.
Okay, so Marilyn asked way back in the beginning, she said, do you have any trauma data on people who had no concept of hell, or a concept of hell that isn't of the Christian variety?
Well, we see a lot of trauma out of Islam, of course. We also see it out of Hinduism. Hinduism is not benign. We also see it from Buddhism, and it oftentimes comes from religious sexual abuse. Many people don't realize it, but Buddhist temples take 9-year-old boys and put them into monasteries for the rest of their life at 9 years old. The amount in Thailand, the amount of sexual abuse is phenomenal, and it leads to lots and lots of trauma. And of course, later in adulthood, acting out and re-traumatizing the next generation of monks in the Buddhist temple. If anybody ever tells you Buddhism is benign, they don't know what Buddhism is. It's a horrendous religion, except in California, of course. But don't let anybody say Buddhism is not. I don't know if that answers the question, but I will. The short answer is yes. We see a lot of religious trauma from other religions that are not Christian, and I could include things like Scientology. I don't think Mormonism is really a Christian religion, but we see a hell of a lot of abuse there too. Do you think that's?
Yeah. I think that answered the question that came up several times. Okay. Another question that came up was about sex addiction or masturbatory addiction isn't real. Then how do you account for secular countries like the Netherlands having those? And are there any sources or studies that you can cite relating to this?
Oh yeah, there's tons of stuff. Go read Dr. David Lay's book, The Myth of Sex Addiction. Or look at my talk. You can Google Daryl and sex addiction, Daryl Ray, sex addiction. You'll get my talk. I don't have time to do the entire talk here. Let's just say that neither the European nor the United States diagnostic documents, the way we define medical terms and psychological terms, has been able to come up with a definition of sex addiction. There is no such thing.
Okay.
However, people do confuse obsession or compulsion with addiction. They're different animals. And when I ask, well, is somebody Facebook addicted? Do you know anybody who's Facebook addicted? Do you know anybody that's Twitter addicted outside of the White House? I'm just asking, So, yes, people can have obsessive and compulsive behaviors. That does not mean they're addicted. And it doesn't mean you're addicted to your own body's sexual response. When we, as a psychologist in treating someone with so-called sex addiction, the first thing I would want to ask them was, who diagnosed you? Well, was it your mother-in-law? Was it your mother? Was it your priest or minister? It's who's doing diagnosis. It's not a trained psychotherapist, because there's no diagnostic criteria for it. You can't diagnose something that has no diagnostic criteria. Now, do you masturbate to the extent that it's interfering with your daily life? If the answer to that is yes, then let's dig down and see what's going on. And almost all the time, we find out you're depressed, that you're going through a relationship breakup. You see an incredible increase in masturbatory activity among both men and women after a divorce. Well, what the hell's going on there? Are they addicted? No, they're trying to deal with the trauma, with the social isolation, with the emotional upset. That's all they're trying to do. And masturbation is one way to do that. It does not mean they're addicted. So as a secular person, we need to help debunk this notion of sex addiction, because it's a religious idea. It was a religious, back in the early 80s, it was actually a religious initiative. This notion of sex addiction comes right out of religion. We got to stop buying into that, because it's bullshit. And ask me if I got any other opinions on that. But do look up my talk, or go read David Lay's book, or read Dr. Klein's essay, "You're Addicted to What?" ? Just put that in, Google it. "You're addicted to what?" ? And read the essay. It'll explain to you why this is a ludicrous thing to talk about sex addiction. Good question. I almost always get that question, and I'm glad I get it, because I think we need to know this, and it's super important.
All right, I've got one. Can someone develop symptoms similar to the ones from having a narcissistic parent from being in a religion with a narcissistic God, like the Abrahamic religions have?
Ooh, good question. I can actually put a lot of theory behind this. Let's just say Are you a dog person, Becca? Or are you a dog person?
I am a dog person.
Okay. How did I know that?
I'm allergic to the cat, but I love my
Oh,
dog.
there you go. Okay.
My dog's sitting at my feet.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Now I'm just going to use this to illustrate. If I said black lab, could you tell me the personality of a black lab? No,
Dopey.
you don't need to. I'm just asking. Could you?
I could tell you the personality of the black labs I know.
Okay, if you were a dog person, you knew dogs. If I said German Shepherd, could you describe the personality of a German Shepherd?
Probably.
Okay,
Maybe.
so what I'm trying to illustrate is if you know dogs very well and you know the breed, then you can predict the personality.
Yeah.
Now think about that. The DNA that causes that dog's personality is the same DNA that causes your personality. If we know from 30 years of research that 50% of all personality is genetic. Yes, it is genetic. It is not environmental. So right off the bat, if you have a genetic tendency towards narcissistic personality, which is probably genetic, you might inherit it from your parents, or you might give it to your children, and then you will grow up to be narcissistic yourself. It will look like, to the observer from outside, it will look like that the narcissistic parent created the narcissistic child, but that's not generally the case. It was the genetics that did that. And we need to start recognizing, it's one of my pet peeves, we need to start recognizing how much genetics plays into our personalities. If you knew my grandfather and you knew my mother and you knew me, you would see the same personality characteristics there. And it's, even if I had never known my grandfather, I would probably have those personality characteristics. So I'm not sure that answers your question totally. I do want to say environment has an impact on personality. It's called, in the psychological research, it's called non-shared environment. And I don't have time to go into that. But let's just say that parents have much less influence on how children, quote, turn out than they want to believe they do. Genetics has a lot of impact. The thing that has the most impact on your personality outside of genetics is your peer group. Your peer group has more impact on how you behave at 21 than your parents had on you. Parents do not like to hear that, but the research shows it without a shadow of a doubt. The parents just don't have that much influence. Now, it's not to say parents aren't important. I mean, they do need to feed and clothe the child, but parents, I mean, the Bible is very wrong in how to raise, spare the rod, spoil the child, raise a child up in the ways of Jesus and it'll go there forever. That kind of bullshit. No, that doesn't work that way, because what if the person has a genetic tendency towards questioning and curiosity? Well, we know that personality speaking, there are some personality types that are very susceptible to religious infection. There are other personality types that are very resistant to it. And I'm guessing, Becca, you might have been one of those kinds that were resistant to it.
Mm-hmm.
You were subjected to it, but and your parents think they're a failure because you didn't turn out like a good JW.
Yes.
Well, that's because your genetics took over.
Right.
And you were, we know that the big five, there's 5 personality components in humans. Only one of them, openness to new experience and curiosity, correlates with religiosity, or reverse correlates with religiosity. So there's pretty strong evidence that genes play a big role. I did not intend to get into that discussion today, but glad we came out.
Well, I've got another question for you here.
Yeah.
I think this question is like about therapists particularly. It says, how religiously literate do you have to be to help an abused person? Do you need to find a different therapist for people who have been abused by different religions?
No, I don't think you do. I think I don't need to be run over by a truck to know it's probably a bad idea to get run over by a truck. This notion that you have to be experienced in something personally before you can help somebody else is is a fallacious argument. I do think the therapist needs to be educated. And I think if you're a Mormon coming into a therapist who's never dealt with Mormonism, you may need to spend some time educating them. Be sure if you're from a high control religion that you recommend they read Dr. Marlene Winnell's book, Leaving the Fold, or read my books, The God Virus. Educate your therapist. Don't assume they already know how to work with you. If you happen to get an ex-Mormon therapist or an ex-Jehovah's Witness therapist, and you're an ex-JW or an ex-Mormon, they may already understand a lot, but the chances of you find somebody that's got exactly the experience you've got is pretty minimal. It's just not going to happen. So
seems like maybe the idea of, well, hopefully the therapy is based on science and data, right? And so it's going to work.
Yeah, right.
You'll be helped no matter what religion instigated the trauma.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, the cognitive behavioral therapy is going to work the same whether you're an ex-Mormon or an ex-Muslim. It doesn't matter. Okay. However, it doesn't hurt for the therapist to understand more deeply the religious environment you're coming from. Because I will say this, in cognitive behavioral therapy, there's certain patterns that we're trained to watch and see. And I know the patterns of Hinduism are different than the patterns of a Baptist. And I know Baptists actually can be quite different in the patterns of a Mormon. The behavior might actually look the same, but the path they got there can be a bit different. So like I say, educate your therapist. They're not going to be an expert on every religion on the planet, but they might be expert enough on high control environments. Because remember, high control does not just mean religion. You could have been in a high control environment just having a parent that was super controlling and wasn't even religious. So anyway, I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I have another one. Is there any research, literature, or resources on shunning and complex PTSD?
Yes, there are. Don't ask me to cite them right now. That's really not my expertise. I couldn't go out and give you 10 journal articles, but there has been some good research on it. You might interact or look on Dr. Marlene Winnell's website, Journey Free. She's got quite a bit of information there. On shunning, what I've seen, what we've noted, although again, I've not done research on this, is that shunning itself creates trauma. I mean, when you lose your entire social structure, social network of support, that's pretty disconcerting. And it takes a lot to deal with that. A very strong person might still be somewhat traumatized. So the fact that I think shunning is designed to traumatize people. It's designed to be able to say, well, see, you're miserable because you left God, because you left our religion. And that's what it's designed to do. And then they play upon that, and they send you emails and they send you memes that say, well, you left God, so that's why you're, in other words, they're trying to explain why you're miserable. I can explain it much better. They fucked you up and they made sure that you felt bad about leaving them, and they won't talk to you anymore, and they send you all sorts of horrible ideas. Well, any normal human being would be affected by that. So yeah, I don't know any specific shunning, but I do know that the Amish have a great system called Rumspringa, where they let people go out and get their wild roots sown at the age of 16, and almost all of them come back because they're traumatized by the outside world. They have no skills, and they may be living on the streets. Who knows? I would come back if I was going to die. I'd probably say, yeah, I'm going to go back to that place I hate. But very few people escape the Amish community. Very few. Although we're seeing a bigger escape number. We're seeing more escaping Hasidic Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, but it's still a tiny number. David
So
David or Jocelyn, I'm happy to go as
Okay.
another half hour if you want to, but I don't want to dominate.
No, I think we've
Yeah.
probably reached the end.
Okay.
Sorry about all I've had apparently just a whole series of computer issues happen, and that happens. Thank you so much for presenting, and thank you so much for sharing with us your wisdom and experience. And thank you, Becca Ray, and thank you, Joseph, for taking the time to also be a part of this dialogue. I truly appreciate it. I think it really did make the conversation that much better. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hopefully you've shared, and any links or any information for people that want to stay in touch with you and would like to perhaps talk to you more. Have we shared the information?
I don't know if they have, but they can go to recoveringfromreligion.org. They can contact me directly at Daryl@recoveringfromreligion.org. They might want to go to seculartherapy.org.
Okay.
Any of those, and they can look my books up, Sex and God or The God Virus, on Amazon.
Okay, I typed in one of those because I can't type that fast, but hopefully everyone got that. So we're good to go. Thank you all for everyone who's been involved with this on YouTube and has been here participating in the Zoom call. Thank you so much for being here. On August 23rd, we're going to be having our next presentation for the CFFC, and we're going to be having Women of Color Beyond Belief with Mandisa Thomas coming up on August 23rd at 3 o'clock. And just to give you some quick details on this, in 2019, the Black Nonbelievers, the Black Skeptics of Los Angeles, and the Women's Leadership Project hosted the first ever conference featuring all women of color, atheists, humanists, secularists, everybody under the, who fell into that category. And with constant calls to action for diversity and inclusion, how can the secular community, better work with and support organizations who are meeting this need? So Mandisa is going to be discussing, the conference goals, the work that women of color are offering the secular movement. She's going to be providing advice on improving communications with people of color and the issues of race, reproductive justice, and other important topics that are affecting marginalized demographics. So please do join us for the next meeting on the 23rd. And thank you all again. Have a great day.
Jocelyn, could I throw something in?
Sure.
Next Sunday, I will be giving a talk to the Dallas Fellowship for Free Thought on Watch What You Think You May Be Listening. If anybody's interested, on kind of the psychology of you're doing therapy on yourself. Watch what you think you may be listening.
I hope I'm listening.
Oh no, many people don't.
I'm not sure I always am, but I would hope most of the time I'm listening.
Okay.
Well, all right. So keep
Thanks.
that in mind for next week. And then the week after that, we will be having Mandisa Thomas here. So
Okay.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Wear your masks. Do what you need to protect yourself and the community around you. Thank you.